Thank you for watching my video of good old wintergreen. It's a 74 CB360 frame and engine. Hopefully the pictures told a nice story, and I'd like to share a few of the project details with you here. Alright, so wintergreen. With this bike, I acquired my first CB360 frame and chassis back in 2019, and I've pretty much carried it around with me through a move and just kind of kept it. And this is not that original bike that I got first, but for all intents and purposes, CB, CJ, CL360, they're all very similar. A lot of interchangeability with parts. But anyway, my inspiration for this project was very much based on I have done a number of single cylinder Hondas, and I wanted to start moving into the twins and the fours. Custom builds or restorations or preservations, that kind of work is a little different than doing just typical maintenance work or rebuilding carburetors or doing tires for someone. I wanted to do a frame-up restoration on a twin. So the reason why I started with this 360 is mainly due to the availability of parts online and the fact that I have been able to acquire a number of these frames and engines over the last 5 years. So I have probably 4 frames and I would guess 5 engines for the 360. There are certain details about it that I'll get into here shortly as to why it may or may not be a good or a great build, and some of the gremlins that you have to fight along the way. But it gives me comfort when I know that I have a whole nother engine that I can bust into if I pull something like the cylinder head and it's not usable. When you're dealing with a vintage Honda and you only have one of everything, especially hard parts, it becomes a little more stressful when you have to buy everything that needs to be replaced as opposed to just going and grabbing one off the shelf. But the overall goal for this, my wife likes to ride on the back of the bike, and I wanted to build something that was really cool looking and really comfortable for us to ride around. And when we go for a ride, we're not riding for hours on end on the motorcycle. It is typically just around town for 20 minutes type of thing. For me personally, this is something that I would ride to go meet her on base for lunch, or when I ship parts to run something to the post office, things like that. That is kind of the inspiration for this specific build. So with that being said, the parts for a 360 are pretty available online. Again, I'll get into some vendor sources here in a bit. And then the evolution of complexity with the vintage Hondas, single, twin, and then inline 4. I've already got my 4 planned for winter of 24-25, so give me about a year and you'll have that video next. It's a relatively affordable platform. I paid somewhere between $100 and $400 for each of my 360s. And to me, that's reasonable. I'm not going to shell out $2,000 on a project. For me, I need to go find it and give someone a couple $100 bills. That makes me okay with that situation. So yeah, that's kind of where we're coming from here. All right, so what I wanted to achieve here, kind of already explained a lot of this, but for the styling, I wanted something kind of like a cafe racer, but more like a Brat. We're not really going scrambler with high exhaust. I wanted a low exhaust for this build. That's kind of why I'm going with the term Brat. I don't, as I get older, I don't like having clip-ons for handlebars. I like my wrists to be elevated a little bit, and that's why I didn't do a more cafe racer swept back style where you're leaned forward a little bit. I prefer an upright seating position as I get a little bit older. The colors, that's all kind of run of the mill. I would say black is a pretty common base color. Black and chrome typically looks pretty good, so I don't really think you can go wrong there. And a lot of the pieces that you buy new are going to be chrome or black. So again, you can't really go wrong there. And then as for the base color on the body pieces, I'll get to that in a bit. But that took some time for me to think about and figure out exactly what I wanted. As for the electrical system on this bike, there are a few ways to do this. So, some people go for a preservation and try to just keep the original wiring harness. For me, I think it's an all or nothing deal. So when I say that, I think you either try to keep everything just kind of stock and not invest the money into new ignition system, new charging system, new wiring harness, or you do everything. So a significant portion of the cost for this project went into the electrical system and the cylinders and pistons. If you omit, and the paint, but if you omit those costs, the actual cost out of my pocket to do something like this is not as high as you may expect. It's when you start getting into those three buckets of paint and all the prep work associated with paint and clearing it, the electrical system upgrades, and the cylinder work. That's where, again, the majority of the budget is allocated to. So that's a little bit about that. I'll wait for the picture to talk about the electrical system. Paint, welding, and upholstery. I don't do upholstery work. I let somebody else take care of that. It's for what he charges. It's well worth it for me to just hand it off to him and get a professional result back. And just walk in and say, I want this in this color and this stitch color and pattern. It's just easier for me. As opposed to like paying someone to paint, which I feel like is the complete opposite end of that spectrum. Minor welding just to the frame to get brackets where I wanted them, and then of course the seat hoop in the rear. All right, so some challenges about the 360. I feel like there are a lot of things that are said online about this bike and this engine, and I'm curious to know how many of those people that say that or these things have actually built one, because I feel like there's a lot of misinformation out there about this platform. But what I will verify and what I will attest to, and Common Motor also talks about this on their website, the cylinder head, and the cylinder head cover are pretty important items to verify before investing. So the cylinder head, the common problem with that, and again, I'm not going to get into this because Common Motor has an entire video on this, the journals get scarred from the cam, and then the cam gets beat up. The tensioner system is something that requires maintenance, and if it goes neglected, it will ruin all of the above. But so the problem is, it's a 50-year-old bike. They sit for a long time. People didn't let the chain slack get taken up by the adjuster on the cam chain, and before you know it, you have a cylinder head that's no good. And that is getting increasingly more and more difficult to find. I have alluded to this in some of my other videos. I am fortunate enough that I have multiple engines, I guess you could say, for this bike. And of the multiple engines that I have, about half of them have good cylinder heads. So again, that's something to be aware of before you start buying parts and investing money. After that, I would say the cam chain system, that needs to be good to go. There are replacement parts available for that for a relatively affordable cost. The other planning with the 360 that needs to take place, the CB and the CJ specifically, you need to mock up how the exhaust is going to work. So it's very likely that you're not going to be able to reuse the stock exhaust. I mean, at least with the bikes that I've bought for a couple $100 out of somebody's backyard, if it's a bike that's been kept in someone's garage, you may be able to reuse the exhaust. but the way it sweeps, the headers sweep down on the CB and past the foot, where your feet rest, the foot rests, rider pegs, however you want to call it. It's a very narrow gap, and that has to be mocked up just right in order to make it all work. So I would make sure you have, at minimum, the stock headers, so those go on, and then you kind of mock up how the exhaust is going to route through there. There's another YouTuber. His name is also James. He runs Slipstream Creations, and I think he's in the Midwest. Yeah, he's in the lower 48 somewhere. And he also talks about how the seat and the fuel tank butt up to each other. And again, that's something you kind of got to plan ahead with. I did that work while the frame was still in rust, if you will, or not painted. But it took me a long time to figure out how I wanted that to work. And I think what I ended up doing, it looks pretty good. I wouldn't say it's absolutely perfect by any means, but it's one of those things where the way the tank secures to the frame, I mean, I did a custom thing where I welded a stud on, but you just have to spend some time here. And again, don't let it be a surprise after you've spent money rebuilding the engine and painting the frame. License plate mounting and seat hoop, more of the same. I'm not going to reiterate here. What a lot of people do on these custom builds is they sweep the seat hoop upward. That way, if they mount the license plate from it, there's an angle and it's clearing the rear wheel. The way this bike is set up is that subframe is shortened quite a bit. So if you just mount a license plate back there, it's going to hit the rear wheel or the rear tire as it's coming around. I want to get to some other misconceptions real quick about my last bullet here. And the last bullet says fuel, air, ignition timing, and charging system. So I agree that the ignition system is it's pretty particular working with points on a 180 twin. So let's start there. The reason why it's particular is the other smaller twins are not 180. So the pistons go up and down together. Whereas on the 360, they do not. So with that being said, they don't go up and down together. So with that being said, they're separate firing sequences. And you have to get everything with the points just right to get the timing just right. And I think that is where a lot of people run into issues with getting these to run right. Now, rolling over from that point, I think a lot of people think, based on what I've read, that it's carburetor related and intake related. And what I'm specifically talking about is I have read several posts online about how these carburetors are near impossible to get tuned correctly with pod filters. And I will disagree with that. I think maybe skips are being stepped or it's not being timed properly, but this bike has OEM carburetors with pod air filters and runs like a champ. It doesn't pull like a sport bike. It doesn't have nearly that much horsepower, but it pulls through the rev range totally fine. So I'm not really sure why everybody says that this bike cannot be tuned to a rideable condition with pod air filters and stock carbs. I think that's misinformation, in my opinion. So I just wanted to give you some reassurance if you're planning on tackling this. Now, with that being said, you have to do your due diligence. The carburetors need to be cleaned. They need to have the right jets in them. And when I say that, I have stock jetting in. I didn't change out the jets for anything higher or lower. And they need to be synchronized. So I will say that if you don't synchronize carburetors, it's not going to run right. And more often than not, when I do something like this, even if the carburetors look like they have never been removed or rebuilt before, I still hook up the vacuum gauges to sync them, and they're typically not in sync. So even if it looks like it's never been touched before, I absolutely think you need to synchronize them regardless. And then the last point here is the charging system. So with this build, I installed a voltmeter up by the speedo, and it gives me, it's a voltmeter, so it gives me the live volts coming off the battery while the engine is running. And with the upgraded charging system from Rick's, it is always above 14 volts, and I never have an issue with it, as opposed to the stock charging system, which is, let's just say, not great. So again, is it is it worth it? If you're going to go on a build like this, I absolutely think it's worth the extra money to know that your battery's being charged properly. But that's kind of my 2 cents on that. All right. So getting into the engine, nothing crazy here, I guess for lack of a better term. Pretty much stock everything except for the cylinders. So I sent them off. I use LA Sleeve in California for a lot of my work, and if it's something I can hone, I do. But something like this, I'm not going to hone it. It's getting bored over, and it's getting done professionally by a machinist that's done this for many, many years. I've shelled out the cash for Wiseco, 50 over, and they are great. It was expensive. It was a big portion of the cost for this build, but it was well worth it in my opinion. The head, I didn't have to send off the head, so I cleaned it up and lapped in used valves. I didn't even go buy new valves. I pulled good valves from what I had, and again, sealed 100% totally fine. So never even had to send off money for that. Engine gasket set available for this engine, no problem. You don't have to go around and buy each little piece individually. You can just buy a complete rebuild kit. I'm pretty sure you can even get a complete engine oil seal kit, 4-into-1. I decided to go with a Vesra gasket set, but again, it's available, which is a good thing. And not only is it available, you can buy it as a kit, so you don't have to spend time figuring out every little piece, and then you miss one, and then you have to wait for it to get in. All right, so on the electrical here, man, when you look at the pictures, it looks like there's a lot going on. It's really not that bad. Let's see. Brick House Builds. I forgot his name. He seems like a really cool dude. But his channel got me into looking into this NWT X21. NWT, they ship out of Missouri, I believe. It's reasonably priced. But basically what I'm getting at is NWT and Moto Gadget make these control units. And in the picture on the right, I'm pointing at a silver little box. And the way these control units work is it basically gives you the freedom to wire whatever and anything you want onto pretty much anything. It's got to be a 12-volt system. For obvious reasons, but it looks daunting when you first look at it or watch a video, but once you get the hang of what needs to happen, it's actually very, very simple to use this. And I've done 3 of them this past winter. They all work, and they all work great. And again, it gives you complete control of how you want to run your lights, which for me is really nice, especially on something like this where it's not going to be OEM. And then on the 200 I did, it looks pretty stock, but it's been upgraded to have LED lighting to include like inside of the original speedo gauge or tachometer gauge. And it's just kind of interesting to be able to throw an LED bulb in there. It's neat. So anyway, that's the X21. Do your own research on that, but well worth what they're charging. It's a great item to do this with. Charging system, I already talked about that. Again, worth it in my opinion. So when I say charging system, I got the alternator, stator, and I believe the regulator rectifier from Rick's. And again, it works great. Ignition system. So back to pistons going up and down together versus opposed. With the 360, it's 180 off. So you have to get 2 sets of timing just right. And, you can sit there with points and you can probably make it happen. It's probably going to take you a bit. With Charlie's Place, again, it's kind of painful to buy it considering it's an older bike. But you set it and it's good to go. It's worth it to me. If everything else is good and running correctly and built correctly, again, to me it's well worth it to just shell out a little more cash for the Charlie's Place electronic ignition. All right, back to this guy. So I spent very little time figuring out what to do with the engine and the frame color. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do with the seat, the grips, and the bodywork. I like how that brownish leather kind of goes with a greenish color. The problem is, I feel like the green has to be just right. So the green has to contrast with the brown just right, but if it's too dark, it will look like the engine and the frame, and I didn't want that either. So again, I spent a long time looking up different paints, and I came up with this Mercedes-Benz Emerald Green Metallic that Mercedes throws on a few of their vehicles. I don't know if it's like a GL5 or what it is, but they have it on this SUV that I saw, and I really liked it. And I did some research, and I went and got a tester for it from my local paint store and shot it. And as soon as I shot it, I thought it was 100% the correct color. I'm really happy with it. It's not cheap, but for 3 pieces, you don't need a whole lot. But I'm really happy with how that turned out. The seat upholstery, I pay a guy locally to do that. I give him the concept, and he does the work. And I provide him the seat pan, so he just has to do the upholstery work. But yeah, well worth it for me to not spend my time trying to do that, and my work will never look as good as his. The handlebars on this bike, I pulled off the rack. They came off of a Z125, Kawasaki Z125. I just had those laying around because I had pro tapers on a Z125, and they actually work pretty well for this build. Maybe I should have painted them, I'm not sure, but for what they are and what they're doing, they work totally fine. The mufflers and the exhaust wrap, I wasn't really sure how I wanted to handle that. I didn't want to spend $500 on an exhaust for this bike. It's just not really worth it to me to do that. So I reused the OEM headers, and I just kind of welded like joints basically to where I wanted the mufflers to fit onto the frame, and wrapped the headers, and that's kind of what happened here. But again, works fine, free flowing, kind of loud for the bike, but again, it's a neat little bike, and I'm probably not going to be riding it for extended periods of time, so that works for me. All right, parts. So this is a majority of where the parts came from. These sources here. 4-to-1 for the 360, and really for a lot of other Hondas, is a great source. There are certain things that I really, really prefer to buy from OEM Honda, but there are certain things that I'm totally okay with buying from other sources. It kind of depends on, for me, if it's engine related or not, and if it's like a structural integrity thing or not. But anyway, 4-to-1, it's a great place to at minimum look up things and get an idea for what they can cost. So I would start there on a bike like this. Charlie's Place and Motorsport Electric, Rick's, I'm not going to get into that anymore. The side covers, so I only have one set of side covers out of the 5 bikes that or 4, whatever it is that I have, and they're all busted up. So for me, do I spend my time trying to save something that is probably not, well, I shouldn't say probably not savable, but is going to be very time consuming to bring back to life, or do I just buy a new set? And I found someone on eBay in the lower 48 that I'm not exactly sure how he's doing this. I kind of feel like he's rebuilding them. They're a little pricey, but it's way cheaper than me spending hours working them. So I decided to buy them, and they come in you got to prime and paint them and clear them, but they work very well for what I needed, and I thought it was well worth his price to just have a good usable set that I could work and paint with the tank at the same time. Let's see, All Balls Racing, get a lot of stuff through them. Again, I never have any issues with All Balls stuff. It just works, mainly fork seals and carburetor rebuild kits and things of that nature. And then, yeah, Honda OEM dealership stuff, never let me down type of thing. All right. So what everybody wants to know, and unfortunately, I do not have a straight answer to this question. How much does it cost to do something like this in 2023? Um, it depends on I feel like everyone who does this will say, oh, it depends on so many things, but it really does. If let's just say the number is X, and I decided not to do boring out cylinders and Wiseco pistons. That significantly reduces the cost percentage of this project. Let's say I chose not to do the charging and electrical system. Again, significantly reduces the cost of this project. Mercedes-Benz Emerald Green Metallic significantly reduces the cost of this project. So it's really difficult to, like, if someone's walking around, sees a bike, and is like, "Hey, I'd like for you to build me one of those. Um, how much is it going to cost?" And I think the average person, well, I know the average person cannot answer all the questions that I'm going to have for them, and therefore I'm not going to be able to answer their question of how much it's going to cost. So, with that being said, it all comes down to, like, you got to do your own research as to what you do and don't want to put on the bike and how you want to and don't want to modify it. And then, of course, this does not include time. So, I don't know how much you're willing to do. I don't know how much you got to pay someone to do. But anyway, like, shop rates aren't getting any cheaper. And I 100% think that if you have the time and the space and the tools, you can get a vintage Honda up and running. If you have the entire bike and it's not, destroyed. But it's just a matter of a lot of factors that need to be figured out. But I don't know. I broke this down into 3 different categories. Like, basically, number 1, just get it up and running. That's what I think it would cost on average. Number 2, getting it up and running in a better way. So refreshing everything, making the suspension like new, making the carburetors like new, doing things like wheel bearings. It just makes the ride better, if you will. And then, of course, like a whole custom build. It's, to me, very difficult to say, like, definitively, this is how much that would cost. Like, the paint alone can vary in a tremendous amount depending on what base you want to shoot. So, again, that's just kind of something that's got to be figured out and planned ahead and yeah, things of that nature. All right, planning and budgeting. I won't really go into that anymore. I feel like I've done that quite a bit. This is something that I think most people don't realize until they do it. And when I say do it, I mean they build a bike. You spend, I would say over the winter, I spent hours staring at the bike, just picturing how I wanted things to flow and go. And I mean, even down to those silly little, like, purple shiny bar end things. I don't even know how that popped into my mind. It just popped into my mind while I was staring at the bike. I was like, man, that brown and green needs, like, an offset color. And I decided to go with that, how they make those, like, chameleon colored purple sprockets. And I was like, man, that'd be cool if I could get one of those. And I just found these on Amazon for next to nothing. Totally worth it. Small detail that I think just adds a little zest to the bike. Modern technology. So this is kind of going with the X21, LED lights, charging system, ignition system. I think it's worth it. I think that if you're going to do other things that spend money on the engine and things of that nature, I would not build one for someone like this without doing that. I'll just put it that way. Painting, more of the same of what I've already said. Safety with vintage builds. So one thing about vintage builds is, and this, in my opinion, is a great thing, is they don't have computers. So, there aren't a lot of fail-safes for if you mess up. I mean, usually the feedback you get is, hopefully it just doesn't start. That way, even worse problems don't occur. But there's no, like, fail-safe. There's nothing protecting you. So you got to be careful with electricity. I mean, 12 volts isn't going to hurt you very much, but you got to know what you're doing there. gas, like if you have a gas leak and things are getting hot, the gas tank is right there. If it leaks down to the engine, I mean, the bike's going to catch on fire if it's hot. So you got to be careful there. Suspension, that's another thing. These are pretty conventional forks, but again, if the bike starts riding and doesn't ride right, you should stop riding it. Brakes, that's a whole other thing. They are hydraulic brake calipers, but they're not like modern hydraulic brake calipers, and it's got to be aligned correctly, and it's got to work, obviously. Yeah, I think that's the majority of that. Chain and sprocket alignment, I used stock frame and swing arm, and stock size wheels, so that wasn't really an issue. Stock hubs. But again, if you start changing those things, you have to make sure they make sense. You can't just start bolting things on and ride down the road at 70 miles an hour and then figure it out. You got to be careful with stuff like that. And then on a final note, I have my wife to thank for this bullet, but she is very good at reminding me as I'm working late and stressing out about little details that probably don't matter much in the long run of life, but you have to enjoy it. It's not something you do to make money, if you will, based on the number of hours that it would typically take to do something like this. And if you're just getting frustrated and failing and not coping with that properly, kind of like what I alluded to with the carburetors, guys saying they have to tune it and change the jets 15 times. I'm not really sure where that logic comes from, but regardless, you can't sit there and have a love-hate relationship with the bike. You gotta enjoy it, and if it starts getting a little frustrating, you just gotta walk away for a second. But I will close with the fact that, in my opinion, it is so worth it. I think it's so neat to have something like this to roll around on, and my plan for this bike, we'll enjoy it for this summer, which would be 2024. We'll probably cruise around on it, and then it'll go to somebody. I'll put it up for sale toward the end of the summer, and I would imagine somebody would like to have it. We'll find out, but yeah, that's kind of my wintergreen build. Again, it's a CB360 board 50 over. Modern lights, modern charging, modern ignition, rebuilt pretty much everything. But yeah, happy to do it. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a message, and I would be glad to help you with it.